Hello guys, welcome to Java tutorial. This is Sabe, your trainer. So today's topic for the Java tutorial is constructor. As we know that constructor is most important or one of the most important topic in Java. So today what we are going to discuss? We are going to discuss about what is the constructor, why we need constructor in Java, then different types of constructor like default, then with no argument constructor, and we have parameterized constructor. So there are different types of constructor. Then we'll see how constructor can be overloaded, that's constructor overloading. Then we will see how the constructor is changed, that is what is the constructor chaining. And like every other method in Java has a specific method signature, similarly constructor in Java has its own method signature. So we will discuss all these points in today's tutorial. So let's first go through the first topic, that is what is constructor. Now constructor in Java is a block of code similar to a method. Okay, so constructor in Java is a block of code that initialize the newly created object. Like in Java we know we create the objects. When we create the object, an instance of a class gets created and we can assign a different values to different objects by using the methods or any other way. Similarly, what we want to initialize those values once the object gets created. That means when we create a different object, we may get a different value for a single variable, a single instance variable of a class. So this is what the constructor is. So main objective of the constructor is to initialize the object. So it means the instance of a class can be initialized when as soon as the object is created. So how does the constructor works? Okay, so for example, let's say I have created one example where I have created one class, that's public class, my class, and in that class I have created a constructor called my class. So there are certain rules of creating or defining the constructor. We'll go through all the rules when we go further for the different types of constructor, or how to create the constructor, how to initialize the constructor. Okay, so before that, just try to understand, okay, we have created one constructor, and in main method, once we have one method, main method in a class. Okay, so this main method has a line called my class obj is equal to new my class. So in this case, my class and brackets, this is the constructor. Okay, so in this way we create the constructor. Okay, my class obj is equal to new my class. The new keyword here creates the object obj of class my class and invokes the constructor to initialize the object. Initializing the object means initializing the attributes or fields of a class, instance of a class, during the object creation itself. Here we are not creating any method to initialize the variables. So we'll see one of the example where we initialize the values inside the class, but we will not create any of the constructor. And then we'll see the difference between the creating the constructor and not creating the constructor. For that, let's go to our Eclipse. Okay, so already I have created one project called Java tutorial, and inside that I have created one package. Let's create one class and call it as without using constructor. So in this class we are not going to define any constructor, but we have certain values like integer a and integer b. Now we want to initialize these values during the runtime, not here. So what we need to do, we need to create one method called as public void init values, and we need to pass the values again like integer a and integer b. Now let's say this dot a is equal to a and this dot b equal to b. Now you people might be knowing that this keyword belongs to, I'm using this keyword belongs to the current object reference. Okay, because here we have used similar variables a and b like these global variables. So once we call this method, compiler won't understand which value we are talking about, so we use this keyword reference to the current object. So the value will pass through this method, then again it will pass to this a, and that a is this one. Okay, so we'll talk about this method and super method later on. Just to know you, I have mentioned little bit about this method, this keyword. Now let's create one more method called public void display, just to display the values just we have created, and in that we have one method to just to print the values of a. So a equal to this a, and similarly just to print the value b. Now let's create one main method inside the class itself. Okay, now when we want to provide the value to these variables, what we have to do, we have to first create the object of this class. And now let's create the object of this class, constructor. Let's call it as without constructor equal to new. So indirectly we are creating one constructor, even though we are not defining any constructor inside it, but we are creating the constructor here. So that's this type of constructor is called as a default constructor. We'll say it later when we go to the types of constructor. Now using this object wc, call the method init values and provide certain values a and b. Okay, now again wc.display method. So in this way we are providing the values to init value method, and it will pass to the init value method, and it will again pass to these global variables, and those values will be printed here. So let's execute this program. Okay, now see the result. The result is a is equal to 10, b is equal to 20. Now this is one of the case. Now what if I want to have multiple values for different multiple objects? So these value belongs to this object wc. But when we want to have multiple values for different values for different objects, then again we have to create one object. Let's call it as w1 wc1. Then again we need to call these methods again. Let's call it wc1 wc1, and let's change the value like 30 and 50. then execute the program again. So we can see two different values or two different objects. So this is the way we initialize the value. So there is no constructor here. We haven't used any constructor here. But my aim would be to not to use this method to initialize the value. What I want as soon as my constructor gets created, I'll delete this one. So as soon as my constructor gets object, so the object is created, these values should get initialized. Okay, so this can be done with the help of constructor. So this is the basic use of constructor. So our next topic is, so why we need constructor. The most important, why we need constructor in during the product development, during the project development, we want certain values to be initialized when an application gets launched, when the object gets created. For example, when our application gets invoked, we want certain values to get set automatically, like the file location, certain numbers, certain IDs, or anything depending on your project requirement. You want these values to be get initialized. You don't want to initialize at the runtime. That means whenever your application wakes up, you want these values to be initialized. So this is the basic need of the constructor. Okay, so next topic would be, let's see what are the different types of constructor. So here I have mentioned three types of constructor: default constructor, empty constructor, and parameterized constructor. So let's go to the Eclipse and see how we can use these constructors in our program. So default constructor. So default constructor means, default constructor is like if we do not implement any constructor in our class, Java compiler insert a default constructor into our code. This constructor is called a default constructor. So let's get back to our program. So here this is the constructor, but we have not declared or we haven't used any constructor inside our program. So the Java compiler automatically creates a constructor. We do not need to define a default constructor. Every Java program, whenever you create an object, a default constructor gets called for that particular class. Okay, so this is called the default constructor. Now let's see the other type of constructor. That is, we will see all these constructor through the program as well, but let's go through these types of constructor first. The constructor with no arguments, or we can call it as an empty constructor. So constructor, empty constructor or no argument constructor. What is this? Constructor can have argument in it. A constructor without argument is known as an empty constructor or no argument constructor, because sometimes we know what value we are going to initialize during the object creation. We know that, okay, sometimes we are going to initialize certain values and we know the values, okay, during the object creation. So let's get back to the Eclipse and create one empty constructor. Okay, I'll close this program. Let's create one class and call as empty constructor demo. Okay, so now here we are going to create our first constructor. So the basic rule of creating the constructor is that constructor should have the same name as the class name. Here the class name is empty constructor. Okay, Now the parenthesis. Since it is empty constructor or constructor with no arguments, we are not going to pass any argument in this constructor. Okay, so we simply just print an statement like this is an empty or constructor with no arguments. Okay, that's it. We are not going to create any method. Let's get one main method, and inside this main method let's create an object of this particular class. So the class name is empty constructor. Let's say emp cnt constructor equal to new. So let's see this empty constructor. Okay, so now since we have not defined any method inside the class, so we are not going to call any method. So this simply the single statement, this single statement will call the empty constructor. Let's execute this program first. Okay, let's save it. Okay, see the statement. This is an empty or constructor with no argument. That means in earlier program we had called a display method. Let's go back to the program. We had called display method just to display the values, but here we haven't called any method, we haven't created any display method to display this string, since we have used a constructor here. Okay, so this is, even though this is empty constructor, it will initialize the instances of this class, and it will execute anything inside the constructor body first as soon as the object gets created. So this is the empty constructor. Okay, now next one is the parameterized constructor. So we have seen the default constructor, we have seen the empty constructor. Now it's time to see the parameterized constructor. It's not always the case that we are going to use only the default constructor or the constructor without arguments. Many a times we need to initialize certain values using the constructor. So let's write one more class and call it as constructor, or let's call it as a parameterized constructor. Same here, we will create one constructor with the class name like public parameterized constructor. Then now this is a parameterized constructor. We will pass some parameters like integer a and integer b. Okay, now let's simply just print these values like a is equal to a, b is equal to b. That's it. Again, here also we are not going to have any method in this class. I'm just trying to simplify the program using only the constructors, just to let you understand the purpose of this constructor, how it initializes the values. Okay, now let's create one main method, and inside the main method just again create one object of this class. Let's say parameterized constructor, parameterized what we call parameterized constructor, like it's pc, then new. Here now the difference here, earlier when we use the constructor without argument, we saw that there was no argument inside the constructor, but now when we try to create the object and we can see the values the parameters in the constructor, and this is called the parameterized constructor. Now let's pass certain values in this constructor. Okay, 20 and 60. That's it. No method calling again using this object. Now let's just print the statement. Okay, see, a is equal to 20, b is equal to 60. A is equal to 20, b is equal to 60. That means whenever we create the object, the values we pass through this parameterized constructor, those values will get initialized here. Now again, what I want to create one more object. Okay, let's call it as PC1 and pass certain different values, 200 and 600, because these values, the copy of these values belongs to this object, but we want another copy of object where we want different values for the same variable. Okay, now let's execute this method. Now we can see a is equal to 20, b is equal to 60 for the first constructor, for the first object, and now a is equal to 200 and b is equal to 600 for second object. So every object, this object will have its own copy of parameters, and this object will have its own copy of parameters. So in this way we can create the parameterized constructor, and during the object, this is the simple example of just passing the integer values. We may have the file location or any other objects we can pass through this, and we can initialize those objects and locations or any other instance of the class by using this parameterized constructor. So this is most important one in the constructor itself. So now let's get back to our PPT. So I have shown the diagram, types of constructor, the default constructor, no argument constructor, and a parameterized constructor. Remember, default constructor, we do not need to define any default constructor, but for empty constructor we have to define a constructor but without any arguments, and in parameterized constructor we need to define the constructor with the parameters, and when we create the object, we pass the values to those parameters, and those values get initialized for every object we create for that particular class. Now let's go back to the constructor. Okay, so this is the constructor chaining. So constructor chaining, before that let's see what is the constructor overloading. Okay, now let's see one program. Like as you know, there is a polymorphism method called as a overloading, method overloading. In method overloading, what we do, we create one method with different parameters, and again we define the same method with set of different parameters or different number of parameters or different types of parameters. Then it becomes the method overloading. Okay, similarly we can use in constructor as well. We can have the multiple constructor in a class with a different type of parameters or different number of parameters. So for that example, let's create one class called as the constructor overloading. Okay, now let's create one constructor called as public constructor overloading, and let's pass certain values. I'm just creating very simple and basic programs. I'm not writing any difficult code so that you won't able to understand, but I'm writing in a simpler way so that you guys can understand everything. So in this parameter we pass integer a, integer and then string name. So let's, in our constructor, print these values like a is equal to this plus a and sys out, then name is equal to this plus name. So this is one constructor. Now let's create one more constructor, one more parameterized constructor, and let's try to create the same copy of constructor. Okay, what will happen? Let's copy these parameters again in this method. Let's see what will happen. Okay, it gives an error. So what it says, rename method constructor overloading, because similar to the method overloading, same type of argument or same number of argument is not allowed in constructor overloading as well. Okay, so let's create another, let's create a one more parameter called a long, let's say salary. Okay, now so we don't see any error, so simply just again print the statement and again for the salary as well. And let's put one more statement here, like calling, let's say 2 argument constructor, and here three argument constructor. Now let's create one main method, and inside the method let's create two different objects with two different constructors. First, let's create one object, constructor overloading. Let's call it as CV equal to new. Now we can see both the constructors. Let's see this one, the constructor with 2 parameters and constructor with 3 parameters. Now depending on your requirement, what you want during the initialization object, so I want to initialize these 2 values for this CO object. So let's pass the integer values and name like XYZ. Okay, now again constructor overloading CO1 equal to new. Again we can see these 2 constructors. Let's see one more, let's call it 60 and ABC. Now create one more object, that is constructor overloading 2, and say constructor overloading. Let's create the constructor with different values like 80, name is NNO, sorry O, and the salary is something this. That's enough, I think. So again, still we are not calling any method, we are just trying to understand how values gets initialized. This is the call, this is called constructor overloading. We are overloading this constructor with this constructor using the same parameter and with one additional parameter for this overloaded constructor. Okay, now let's execute this program. See what is the output. See, calling the constructor 2 Okay, a is equal to 30, name is equal to xyz. Okay, constructor with two arguments. Okay, now calling the constructor with two arguments again with different values, and now three argument constructor a, so third constructor gets executed. So this is how we can overload the constructor for the same value. Suppose we have the instance variable like integer m, and then integer uh, and anything else, and when we pass these values to these constructors, and when we call this constructor, remember the latest constructor, the value of latest constructor will get overwrite since it is a global variable. So these are the shared variable inside the class. So this is how we overload the constructor. Okay, now let's get back to our agenda for today's tutorial for the constructor. Now, constructor chaining. What is constructor chaining? Constructor chaining is calling, when we call a constructor from another constructor, is called a constructor chaining. So we create a chain of constructors. We call one constructor from another constructor. Okay, for there are two ways. There are two ways to call a constructor from another constructor. Okay, so from within the same class. So for example, we have two constructors in a class, and we want to call one constructor into another constructor in the same class. Then it can be done using this method using the keyword this. Since I told you earlier, because this belongs to the reference of the current object. Okay, now for the constructor in the same class and from the base class, like we have the base class, and we have inherited the child class from the base class, and we want to call the constructor of a base class into a subclass. Then we have to use the super keyword. Remember, these two keywords are very important. Okay, so this keyword is used to call the constructor within a class, and super keyword is used to call the constructor from the base class. Okay, so there are certain rules for constructor chaining, like this expression should always be the first line of the constructor. For example, there is a constructor 1 and constructor 2, and we want to call the constructor 1 in constructor 2. Then this keyword will be the first line of the constructor 2. There should be at least one constructor without this keyword. This is again one of the rule for constructor chaining. And constructor chaining can be achieved in any order. It does not matter the order of the constructor 1 2 3 4, or the constructor 2 3 4, or the constructor 1 4 2. So it does not matter the order of the constructor. We can call any constructor inside any other constructor. Okay, so let's see the examples of constructor chaining within the same class and from the base class using this method, and using this keyword and using the super keyword. Okay, let's get back to our Eclipse. Let's close all these programs first, and let's create one class called as same class constructor chaining thing. Okay, it looks a bit of a long class name, but it makes sense to understand. Okay, now in this, let's create one constructor, that is same class constructor demo. Okay, This is our first constructor. Remember, this is again, this is an empty constructor. Okay, now I'll create one more constructor. It is public, same class constructor. Now let's have one constructor with one parameter. Let's call it teacher X. Okay, we will define the body very soon. Just we are designing the constructors, constructor chaining. Then let's have one more constructor, same constructor, and now we have two parameters in this constructor, integer X comma integer Y. Okay, so what we have done, we have created three constructors. So let's put some statements here like this: system .println, and with C, and this is constructor without arguments. Okay, now let's print the value of X. What? X is equal to X, and now print the value of X is equal to X. Now Y is equal to plus Y. Okay, so look at this program closely. So what we have done, we have created a class called same class constructor chaining demo, because we are creating the chain of constructor. This is different type of constructors. So in this case we have used different types of constructor, like constructor without parameter, constructor with single parameter, and constructor with multiple parameters. Okay, now let's create constructor chaining. Okay, now in this case, like I said, okay, I want to call this constructor into this constructor. Okay, the first constructor I want to call is a single parameter constructor into an empty constructor. So how can I achieve this? Like I said earlier, two within the same class, it can be done using this keyword. So whenever we want to call a constructor within a class into another constructor, we need to use this keyword. Now control space, we can see we can call any of the constructor. Okay, what we have used this keywords. Let's call this constructor and pass certain values like 50. Okay, so this would be our first statement. Let's put this statement below this statement. It will show an error because constructor call, constructor call must be the first statement in a constructor. Okay, let's undo this one. So our first rule satisfies that this keyword should be the first line of any calling constructor. Okay, now in this constructor, let's call this constructor. In single parameter constructor, let's call the constructor with two parameters. Again, same thing, we need to use this keyword, and let's provide certain values like 20 or for example 30. Okay, so in this way we have created a chain of constructors. So this is called the constructor chaining. Calling one constructor into another constructor is called a constructor chaining. Okay, now let's create one main method. Okay, main method. Inside the main method, just create one object of this class, like same constructor demo. Okay, let's see, same constructor demo equal to new C. We can call any of the constructor, but we will call the first constructor which has created the chain. Okay, let's create the empty constructor. Okay, because already we have passed the values into these constructors, so we don't need to create the object using these constructors. Okay, now let's execute this program. See what we can see. We can see the value of x. Where is x? X is this. And where we have called it? We have called the constructor here. Okay, then y is equal to 30. Where is y? Y is here. And see the 50 value for this constructor and these two for this constructor. So the chain has been created. And last one is the constructor without argument. It's been called because since it is a default constructor, so it will get executed automatically. This one. Okay, so this is how we create the chain of constructors. Okay, and we have seen how we created the chain of constructors within the same class. Now let's create one more program for super keyword. Super keyword, like I said, from the base class. If we want to call a constructor from a base class, we need to use the super keyword. This is important one. Okay, so let's get back to our Eclipse again. Close this output. Now let's create one class called as superclass. So in this case we need to use the concept of inheritance, because we are extending the two classes. Okay, so let's see how can do it. Let's call it as a super class. Okay, and inside the super class, let's create one constructor public super class. Okay, now again print like this is, or I will simply say default constructor. Okay, default constructor. Now let's create one more constructor with the parameter let public super class and pass the one parameter, that is string name. Okay, so let's create one instance of this class, like instance variable of this class called string name. Okay, so we provide the value this dot name equal to name. Okay, and let's have one statement calling parameterized constructor from super class. Okay, so what we have done, we have created two constructor in this class. One is the empty constructor and one is the constructor with one parameter only. Nothing special about this class. Okay, now let's create one more class called as the child class. Okay, now extend this class extends with superclass. So all the objects, all the qualities of superclass will be inherited to child class. But the one of the rule is that constructors cannot be inherited. We need to call them. Okay, now let's create one constructor in this class as well, child class, and this will be our constructor with no argument. So let's print this statement that constructor without parameters from child class. Okay, now create one more constructor called as child class, and it will be our parameterized constructor, again the string name. Okay, now what actually we are going to do here? Okay, what we are going to do, we are passing the values to superclass constructor, this, okay, by using the child's constructor. So what we are going to do, let's see, main method, what we do, we create the object of child class. Okay, so let's create object of child class cc, child class cc equal to new child class. Okay, and we will call parameterized constructor because we want to provide the value of from the child class constructor to the parent class constructor. Okay, see the name, let's say test name. Okay, so but here we are not calling the constructor of the superclass. Since we need to provide the value to this constructor, we need to call this constructor into our child class. So like I said earlier, okay, so we need from base class. If you want to call a constructor from a base class, we need to use the super keyword. Okay, so what we do, we will use super. See, say this super, that means this is the empty constructor from the superclass, and this is a parameter constructor from, see this one, the superclass. So we will call this one, and we will pass the parameter same as it is the name, and we will pass the value to this constructor using this constructor from here. Okay, now let's execute the program. See, calling parameterized constructor from superclass. Okay, and now again we can print the name is equal to plus name, or this dot name. So execute the program again. So what we are going to do is, what we have done, we have passed the name using the child's constructor. We call the superclass constructor using the keyword super, and where this constructor is, this is the constructor we have called. We have provided the name as a parameter, and just we are printing this one. Okay, so this is the way we create the constructor chaining. Okay, now like I said, constructor chaining can be achieved in any order. So there are certain rules for defining the constructor. Okay, always remember these rules. What are those rules? Constructor should have same name as the class name. Let's go back to our program. So see the constructor, it will always have the same name as the class name. We cannot have different name other than the class name for the constructor. Okay, then constructor should have the same access modifier as class, same access modifier of same, because what exactly happens, for instead of this public, if we make any constructor as private, the object of that class will not get created. If you want to see, let's have an example. Let's call it a C private constructor class and make private class, nothing else. We don't want any thing to be initialized using this constructor, just to print okay, this is private constructor. Okay, now let's create one class called as a main class, and now let's see, but first let's make it public and see what happens. See, in let's have main method, main class, and now create the method of this private constructor class. Let's say private constructor class pcc equal to new. Now we can see the constructor of private constructor class. That means we are able to create the object of this class. Okay, because since it is a public, now so we can have this and object gets created. Okay, now let's delete this one and again there is this complete, and now make this constructor as private. Okay, now again try to create the same object for the same class, private constructor pcc equal to new. Now we do not see the constructor, we are not able to create the object. So it means if you want to prevent your class to create an object for that class, we can make constructor of that class as private, so the object of that class cannot be created. Okay, so rules, so this is like same, it should be public if you want to create the object of that class, so the constructor should be should have the same modifier as class. Now no return type, get back to our class. So see, there is no return type. Remember, when we create a method, what we do, like similar public void. Okay, and if suppose we have the return type, void means it's not returning nothing, public integer, that means the method we are creating, it will return an integer value, or the public string, so it will return the string value. But constructor does not return any value, not even the void. Okay, this is the again the next rule. Now the class can have more than one constructor. We have already seen in our program like constructor overloading, so we can have n number of constructor depending on your project requirements. Constructor cannot be abstract, final or static. Like I said, final, again it cannot be inherited. Then if it's static, since it is an object, static is always an class variable, but object is an instance of a class, so object of a class cannot be static. Okay, then if constructor is defined as private, then the object of the class cannot be created. We have already seen. So this is all about the tutorial for the constructor. So what we have seen, what is constructor, why we need constructor, type of constructor, constructor overloading, constructor chaining, and certain rules of constructor. Okay, thank you. Thanks for watching the video. Thank you.